The new CPI data just came out and shocked the market. So this begs the question, is inflation about to explode again? I'm going to answer this for you in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over real wages. You ever notice how you go to the grocery store over the last couple years and every single time it seems like the stuff you're buying goes up and up in price? Or said another way, it seems like your paycheck buys less and less and less. This is all about your income relative to consumer price inflation. And as we know, the government likes to fudge the numbers quite a bit. So let's go over a chart. It goes back to 1998 all the way to today's date. And in fact, actually, before we get into this chart, let's go over to the CPI report that I was referring to earlier. We can get into the nitty-gritty of the data and see just what is going on with consumer price inflation and why was this so shocking for the market. Editor, let's cut to the internet.
Okay, going straight over to CNBC, here's the inflation breakdown for January 2024 in one chart. That was the most recent report that just came out. So the key talking points, consumer price index rose by 3.1%. That's a year-over-year rate. What really shocked the market is that the month-over-month consumer price inflation went up higher than they were expecting. So moving down, we get to this one chart that they're referring to. And again, I want to be very clear. These are not George Gammon numbers. I didn't Photoshop these numbers. You can go to their website and see them for yourself. This is straight from the mainstream media. In fact, if we look at the source of the data, it's straight from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics. Another thing I want to point out is the items in bold represent major consumer price index categories. Okay, so at the top, all items, 3.1%. Got it. We've got food at 2.6%. Food at home, 1.2%. Now what they do is they break down some of the line items for this main category. So again, the main category is food at home, 1.2%. But then we get into the actual detail and we see that juices up 29%, uncooked beef up 10.7%. It goes all the way down to the lowest increase was carbonated drinks at 4.8%. Now, I realize this probably is an incomplete list, but these are the numbers coming directly from CNBC. These are the ones they chose to actually show us. Now, I'm no math genius. Most of you know I barely graduated from high school. But even I can tell that it's really difficult to get 1.2% from 29, 10, 8, 7, 5, 5, 5, and 4.8. Oh, but wait, there is more. Let's go down to all items less food and energy that clocks in at 3.9%. Okay, so we start at motor vehicle insurance, which was up not 2.6%, but 20.6%. 20.6%. Repairs of household items up 18.2%. Admission to sporting events up 13.5%. The lowest increase was haircuts, and that was up 4.2%. So again, if our range is 4.2% to 20.6%, how are we getting 3.9%? And I know right about now your friend and family member Fred is saying, oh, that George guy, he doesn't even know what he's talking about. He's got to realize that the CPI is a weighted index. And the majority of the calculation comes from housing prices or owner's equivalent rent. So even though these prices range from 29%, 20%, let's say all the way down to 4.8%, meaning that these numbers would show no relationship whatsoever to 3.1%, which is the headline number. You've got to look at owner's equivalent rent. And if that's at, let's say, -2, well, then that's obviously how the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics came to this conclusion. They're just doing a good job. It's just you crazy tinfoil hatters are too ignorant to understand statistics. Okay, fair enough. Let's go down in the article where they actually go over the cost of shelter. Did it go down? No. It actually went up by 6%. And last time I checked, 6% is a lot higher than 3.1. Now, I realize they left out a lot of line items, but I think what we can safely conclude by the numbers that came straight from the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics that CNBC chose to show us in this one chart that explains the CPI report from January of 2024 is that the government is wildly understating the rate of consumer prices for the stuff you actually buy daily. Now, I'm not saying that prices haven't come down since June or July of 2022. They absolutely have. But if we just look at a basket of the stuff that you really buy, mainly rent, food, energy, there is no way that you can say right now, year over year, those prices have only gone up by 3.1%.
Step number 2. Now let's go over real wages. In other words, wages adjusted for inflation. Back in 1998, year over year, right around 5%, and it goes back down, kind of bottoms out in 2010, as you would imagine, a little under 2%, and then goes up slightly, goes way up when we were getting stimmy checks, let's call it in 2022, and then since that time, it's gone back down to, we'll call it about 5% year over year. But as most of you know, wage growth isn't really what's important. It's wage growth relative to the prices of the stuff you buy daily. So if we're to believe the government, they would tell us that consumer price inflation year over year was right around this green dotted line. I just took it back to 2012 just so you understand the concept. So here we would have positive wage growth, and that goes up to a point in 2022 when the admitted CPI was 9.1%. Now, during this time, even based on the government's statistics, we had negative real wage growth because nominal wages were not keeping up with the rate of inflation. But now, if you look at this 3.1% relative to the approximately 5%, you would come to the conclusion that real wage growth was positive. So people's incomes were going up at a faster rate than the prices of the stuff they buy daily. At least this is the narrative that the mainstream media and the government is trying to push. We'll go ahead and call this the CP lie instead of the CPI. Big shout out to my good buddy, Jason Burrick, for that one. But now let's look at reality. This red line, I don't think there's anyone, whether your political affiliation is on the left, on the right, in the middle, nobody watching this video would say that prices have only gone up by 3% over the last year. And I think if you would have asked them back in 2012, 14, 16, 18, if prices were only going up by, let's say, 1.5%, they'd say, not based on my bank account, not based on the stuff I'm buying in the grocery store, not based on the rent checks I'm paying, or my kids' health insurance, or their college tuition, etc. I would say the real inflation rate, based on what I'm seeing in my own life, is maybe around 4 or 5%. So if we actually had a realistic measurement of what prices were doing based on the stuff you actually buy, we would see that the red dotted line is higher than this blue line. And I'm just assuming that it's only 2 percentage points higher. I think a lot of you would argue that it's even more extreme. But the punchline here is this takes us to where we are today, where the real rate of inflation is probably maybe 5-6% year over year, which would mean that wages still aren't keeping up. And I think this is much more consistent with what we see in the real world, what I see in the comment section of my YouTube videos, what people are telling me all the time. It's becoming harder and harder and harder for people to put food on the table and a roof over their head. Step number 3. So we understand the problem. The question is, will it get worse? Let's go right to a chart going back to 2004 to today's date. On the left, we go from 0 up to 10% and then down to 5%. This would be the official CP lie. Again, big shout out to my good buddy Jason Burke. He's the one that invented that. Perfect way to describe headline inflation numbers coming from the government. But back in 2004, the CP lie, right around 2%. Oddly enough, it went up to about 5% right in the middle of the recession that we had in 2008. I actually didn't know that before looking at this chart. As you would expect, goes down to negative numbers in 2009. We had actual deflation. Now, I'd like to point out before we move any further that this type of deflation didn't really benefit the consumer. Now, it might have benefited some people. It is true, if prices go down, that's good, but only if you didn't lose your job or your life savings with your home equity being blown up, or losing half your net worth by your stock portfolio being cut in half. More on that in just a moment. But then inflation goes back up to, let's just say 2%, kind of hovers around, goes down, almost hit 0 in 2014-15, goes back up because the Federal Reserve did such a good job of getting inflation up to their target. Remember, back during this time, the Federal Reserve was trying to create inflation, if you remember that. Be careful what you wish for, Jerome Powell. Anyway, fast forward to 2021 and 2022, and it spikes up to 9.1%. So what we have to do to determine the probabilities of it spiking again, or maybe going even higher in 2024 or 2025, I'd like to remind everyone that in 1947, it got up to 19%. So if we're going to determine the probabilities of it going higher, or maybe going as high as it did in the 1940s, we have to understand what caused this spike to begin with. So it starts with M2 money supply going parabolic. Editor, go ahead and throw up that chart. And we remember that in 2020, 2021, where the M2 money supply went up by 25% approximately. And then, of course, we had all the supply chain disruptions by the central planners, the authoritarians, the government, locking you in a cage. So the amount of stuff available goes down, but demand goes up due to stimmy checks. What do you think is going to happen to the consumer price inflation or consumer prices? But what most people don't realize is due to all of this government deficit spending, it really increased the rate of velocity. Now, it is true that at the beginning of the cerveza sickness, the velocity crashed, as you would expect. But because of the composition of M2 money supply changing due to the government deficit spending, we saw a significant rise more recently with velocity, which I think contributed to the consumer price inflation more than M2 money supply going up in and of itself. Let me explain. We start by going over to the government and everybody's favorite, your drunk, insolvent Uncle Sam. So he was deficit spending, but to be clear, that's money that he's spending above and beyond what he's collecting in taxes. So what happens? Janet Yellen has to issue treasuries at the auction to collect the money to go ahead and re-spend it back out into the economy. So insert the average Joe. We'll just go ahead and use him as a proxy for the aggregate balance sheet of society at large. And then we're going to break it down to another level when we're going to insert Moody the Millennial. More on that in just a moment. So Janet Yellen wants to spend all this, or your drunk insolvent Uncle Sam wants to spend all this money. And so he says, Janet, go to work, sister. So she sells all these treasuries. Well, Joe has $100 in his savings account, and it's not really doing anything. He says, I don't need this money for rent or to buy Chipotle or Uber. So I'm going to go ahead and buy a treasury from Janet Yellen because she's willing to pay me, let's just say 5.5%. That seems like a better deal than I can get in my checking account or my savings account. So what happens, the $100 goes to the government, to the TGA, to Janet Yellen, and she issues a treasury that goes onto Joe's balance sheet. Now what's interesting is if we are to assume that Joe represents the aggregate balance sheet for society at large, when Janet spends that money back into the economy, it goes right back on to Joe's balance sheet. But let's actually think how the aggregate balance sheet has changed. So it starts with $100 in savings, but then it turns into $100 in checking, but Joe receives that treasury for the $100 that he gave Janet Yellen to begin with. Now, if that's getting confusing, let's go ahead and break it down, like we said earlier, and let's add in Moody the Millennial. Editor, maybe you can help me with this because I forgot to draw them. Got to watch those pronouns on the whiteboard. So Joe started with the $100 in savings. Now he has the treasury. Well, Moody most likely has the $100 that went into their checking account. Well, when it was with Joe, the velocity was very, very low. But Moody's going to take that $100 and they are going to go out and go to the movies. They're going to go to the bar or restaurants, the cafes, maybe use it to pay their car insurance, something like that. But the $100 is going to circulate at a much faster rate, even though M2 money supply to begin with was 100 and it finished at 100. On net balance, there was no change, but that velocity went up due to the government deficit spending and changing the composition of the actual currency units that are in the real economy chasing goods and services. So I know a lot of you right about now are probably saying to yourself, okay, George, well, the government is still running these massive deficits, and I don't see that changing anytime in the future. In fact, it's probably going to get worse. So if what you're saying is true, we should assume there's going to be another inflationary wave, but not so fast. Let's remember, there's a lot of different variables that go into prices going up or down. The way I like to look at it is there are these cross currents that are always at play. So it's not that we either have inflation or deflation. We have inflationary pressures all the time. We also have deflationary pressures all the time. It's just which one is more powerful. So we explained why the inflationary pressure won the tug of war back in 2021 and 2022. But now let's remember that we have Japan just announcing that they went into recession. China is actually experiencing deflation, not disinflation, but deflation. And we know that they cook their books or lie just as much or even more than the United States government does. So if they're admitting to deflation, remember that's a sign of economic weakness, you know it's likely a lot worse than the headlines would lead you to believe. The UK, I believe they just announced that they went into recession, possibly Germany as well. So it's very likely that the Eurozone is headed straight for a hard landing. Well, you guys know as well as I do that the global economy is very interconnected. The United States is a big part of that. So can we safely conclude that if all of the rest of the world or the major economies are going into recession, maybe even something worse, that the United States will be able to get around that somehow? The United States is going to remain resilient? Absolutely not. We've got to assume that the United States is headed for a recession as well. And of course, the yield curve would back up that assumption. And again, there are no certainties, there are only probabilities. But that's what we're trying to figure out. So if you want my base case, I would say that over the short term, maybe over the next year, we could see something like we saw in 2009, where we have actual price deflation. But the government's response to that will lead us to that very next wave of consumer price inflation like we saw during the cerveza sickness. Now, does that take us up to 9%? Or does that take us up to like 12 or 15 that we saw in the 1970s? Or does that take us up to 19% that we saw in 1947? Well, my crystal ball of probabilities is good, but unfortunately, it ain't that good. So you're gonna have to stay tuned to the George Gammon channel and see how this plays out. But I can tell you one thing that will definitely be a factor, and that is the banking crisis that started in March of 2023, and we're seeing come to the surface once again. For some content on how that may play out, check out this link right here. I'll see you on the next video.